Hello and welcome. Secularists are worried all is not well in their world. Richard Dawkins in particular is deeply distressed and disturbed because a wave of high-profile Christian conversions has begun to gather momentum, and it's seriously alarmed him. As we know, secularism has one lens essentially through which it perceives and assesses things. It peers or squints through an empirical prism that recognises really power and politics only. And because of the shock of this wave of conversions, and some commentators have been trying to explain the whole phenomenon politically, as if there is only the language of politics and power. And so they've been warning publicly about the way in which the radical right, it's always the radical, isn't it, or extreme or hard. There's no moderate right to leftists. The way in which the radical right has begun to turn to Christianity as a way of trying to steady its balance in the face of a series of cultural and political challenges. They follow the old Freudian notion that Christianity is a crutch, and now the radical right needs a crutch, so it's gone all Christian. I was reminded of the advice when I was a child to learn some foreign languages. The Germans and the French speak differently, they think differently, they have different values and imaginations from the rather isolated English. They see history, politics, and even law and legal systems differently. Translation dilutes more than the words, but if having access to different languages is important culturally, it's absolutely vital philosophically. The great and tragic flaw in progressive culture is that it's locked into a single language, a single philosophy, a single dimension of human experience. And essentially it all comes down to power relations. Every so often, in their world, as in most worlds, there's an earthquake and the map is changed. And then there are more prisms to understand ourselves, we find, than simply power. Secularism, in the face of the earthquake and this discovery, is shocked to its core. And few recent shakings of this secular world have been as powerful as the conversion to Christianity of one of the foremost new atheists. Christopher Hitchens, remember him? A wonderful man. What a gift of loquacity. He regarded Ayaan Hirsi Ali as one of the most important public intellectuals probably ever to come out of Africa. And it's her that we're talking about. She was born in Somalia. She was born a Muslim. She and her family fled Somalia and they arrived in Holland, where they applied for political asylum. She renounced Islam in 2003. She found herself elected very young to the lower house of the States General in the Netherlands. She became a prodigious writer. Time magazine praised her and described her as one of the most significant 100 people in the world. Then she moved to America. She took up a post at Stanford and she writes regularly for Unheard. Known as a leading voice amongst the new atheists throughout the whole world, it's hard to overstate the seismic shock of her announcement in the autumn of 2023 that she'd become, of all things, a Christian. Richard Dawkins, who had counted her as one of his very best friends, as a solid ally in the atheist and the secular cause, was shocked to his core. He even wrote a public letter to her saying, "You can't possibly be a Christian." Let me quote from parts of it. "Someone of your intelligence," he said, "can't believe you have an immortal soul that will survive the decay of your brain." He appealed to her. He said, "Ayaan, I've always thought of you as one of the most brave people I know. How could you succumb to this weakness?" Well, let me take a moment to turn to Edward Feser on Richard Dawkins, because I think Feser really very pithily and succinctly exposes the superficiality of the preconceptions that lie behind Dawkins's worldview. He's a very nice man, very clever man, but he has a very limited perspective on things. Feser writes, I've always thought, no, this is I wrote. I always thought that one of the motivations for secularism and atheism is the escapist determination not to be accountable to the moral standards that lie behind the universe, which constitute holiness, and in the face of which we all crumple, wither, and frankly hide, like Adam in the garden. Adam, where are you? But here is Fazer. This is what he wrote. Dawkins, as I've said, says Fazer, tells us there's absolutely no reason to think that the unmoved mover, the first cause, etc., is omnipotent, omniscient, good, and so forth. Fazer says perhaps what Dawkins meant to say was there's absolutely no reason, apart from the many thousands of pages of detailed philosophical argumentation for this conclusion that have been produced right down all the way through the centuries by thinkers who were genius, and which I'm not even going to bother to try to answer, says Fazer on behalf of Dawkins. So, a slip of the pen, perhaps. Better for them, says Fazer, to deny the mind, and with it rationality, truth, and of course science itself, than to admit that human beings might have a soul, which one of the things Dawkins was so distressed that Ayaan thought. Once again, the secularist manifests the very dogmatism, says Fazer, of which he accuses a religious believer, and in rationalising it is willing to contemplate absurdities of which no religious believer has ever dreamed. The absurdity, for example, of a meaningless universe containing meaning. Here's a lovely phrase which Fazer ends. A copy of Skeptic magazine ostentatiously tucked under his arm, the Darwin fish on the bumper of his car, proudly signalling his group identification with other members of the herd of so-called independent thinkers. He knows there is no God. Yet he isn't entirely sure whether the thoughts thinks he's having are real or not. But he's pretty sure that his selfish genes and or his memes in some way manipulate his every action. That he has confidence in, and quite certain that there's nothing questionable, per se at least, about a man marrying another man, or strangling an unwanted, disabled infant before birth, or nearly afterwards now, or sodomizing a goat or a corpse, if that's what you're into, if that you were born as. Despite his hatred of religion, he thinks global warming a greater danger than, for example, Islamic terrorism. And whether meat is murder is a proposition he thinks eminently worth of consideration. But, despite Dawkins' complete incomprehension, here are the reasons that Ayaan gave for the U-turn in her life. Now we finished with Fazer on Dawkins. We'll turn to her instead. As she explained her decision, she said that her journey to atheism had in part been caused by her repudiation of the Islamic presentation of God, of Allah, who she thought Allah was. But her realization that the whole of Western civilization, which she had come to treasure, was under a profound threat, presented her with a crisis to which she had no solution. There was, it seemed to her, nothing to be achieved amongst the new atheists, who were joined together by simple repudiation rather than a capacity for renewal and restoration. Little, it seemed to her, could be achieved by repeating the mantra that all atheists shared and celebrated, that, ha-ha, God was dead. The Christian West, she wrote, has a legacy that consists of an elaborate set of ideas and institution designed to safeguard human life, human freedom, and human dignity from the nation state and the rule of law to the institutions of science, health, and learning. As Tom Holland has shown in his marvellous, far-reaching book, Dominion, all sorts of apparently secular freedoms which we take for granted, freedoms of the market, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech and to the press find their roots in Christianity. They haven't flourished in other systems. And she wrote, "So I've come to realise that Bertrand Russell and my atheist friends failed to see the wood for the trees. The wood is a civilization built on the Judeo-Christian tradition," she said. Well, the critics didn't take her at face value. They were sure that her move was much more of a political one than an existential one. But recently, she explained that wasn't true. She elaborated and described the process by which she discovered Christ personally. She found herself experiencing a period of profound despair, a mixture of the existential and the metaphysical. So, as you would do, she resorted to the best therapy that money could buy. It didn't go very well, except for the time when one therapist suggested that she might actually be spiritually bankrupt, and this could be something she might want to discuss together. Not entirely usual for therapists, but this one did. Well, Ayaan demurred. She complained. She hated the image of God that she had in her head. She didn't want to talk about it. And so the therapist asked her if she would describe what kind of God she might like to believe in were he to exist. To her immense surprise, the figure that she described once she'd finished the process of thinking through it bore an astonishing, a striking, and an immediate resemblance to Jesus, and Jesus did exist. She discovered to her great surprise and relief that Jesus was the answer to her question, to the depths of her despair, that he was the solution to her pain. Her conversion might have been political, but it was also relational. She said, "I've turned to Christianity because I ultimately found life without any spiritual solace unendurable, and indeed very nearly self-destructive." No Catholic should be surprised at that. St. Augustine advised us that the template of all human seeking could be summed up in this reflection that he left us with. "Lord, you've made us for yourselves, and our hearts are restless until they find themselves resting in you." If Ayaan Hirsi Ali is a ripple, the accompaniment of Russell Brand, Tammy Peterson, and Candace Owens in the last few months looks like the beginning of a small but significant wave. Things are on the change.